And this is one that's been put together by David Percy, and I've just made an animated version of it. You know,
this is a NASA photograph. Yeah.
This is the Apollo 17 mission. So what we've got here is we have two pictures taken supposedly at different times on the same mission, both Apollo 17, and we see that in one shot we see a large lunar module quite close to it, maybe, I don't know, 20 feet away or something, and then in another shot we see an astronaut in the foreground, and we see the lunar module over to the right in the distance, maybe 300-400 yards away, something like that. But when you overlay these two sets of images, you can see that the backdrop is identical. The field within the backdrop is absolutely identical.
So there's no way the lunar module would move from there over to there, where it is.
How would it? It would have to take off and land again if that's indeed what happened, which is clearly ridiculous.
So that's a fake background.
I think that this indicates that Jay Weidner is right, and what we're seeing, this line here, is the edge of the stage, and we've got the front projection in the backdrop.
Right. And Weidner does demonstrate. He draws a line on a lot of the NASA images, saying, right, that's the end of the set, and that's where the
screen is.
That's where the screen starts.
Yeah. So I mean, I think
that's the giveaway in this front projection screen system.
Right.
You always have a border or a line where the set ends and the screen starts, and it's that line that you can sometimes identify, because the texture of the set will be slightly different to the texture of the artificial background.
Correct. They can't quite match up the the details of it, and I think that is, I would get, to me, that I think that is what we're seeing in this picture. You can see just below the hill there, we've got that front projection line going right across from right to left.
And of course, this is quite a late mission. Apollo 17. So what year we're talking? Early 70s?
That would have been early 70s, I think. Yeah, again, I don't know all the dates of all the missions, and people have criticised me because I don't know all the Apollo statistics, and so on. But
now then, we were just looking at this image of an Apollo 17 mission, which to me, assuming that's correct, that they're both NASA images, that's a smoking gun really for me. What do you want to talk about next, Andrew?
Well, again, there's probably one of the other things which isn't discussed that much on the web is the pictures of the lunar rover. There's some interesting things about the lunar rover. As you may be aware, the lunar rover was only taken up to the moon, according to the official story, on the later missions. It wasn't, I don't think, until Apollo 16, I think, was the first mission where they used a rover. Other people have measured, for example, the size of the rover and found that even if the wheels were folded up as is claimed, there wasn't enough space to it to fit. There wasn't enough space for it to fit in the command module.
Right.
Other people have. I haven't done that measurement, but apparently people like Jim Collier did that, and say that they didn't have enough space for it in the first place. These pictures that I've got on the screen here, which we can show, are very unusual. They look fine, again, when you look at them initially. But if you study them carefully, there are no tracks around the wheels. It's like this rover has been picked up with a crane and dumped on the set, or the tracks go in the wrong direction. What image over on the right, which is AS17-135 20544, you can see there aren't any tracks, in the front or back of the rover. It looks like it's just been dumped on the set. So I have those problems. Whilst we're on the subject of the lunar rover, I can also go to some other data which somebody sent me a few years ago, and it's to do with the battery system on the rover.
Before you go to that, Andrew, we need to just explain what the surface temperature of the moon is when it's lit by the sun. Just explain.
Yes, well, I mean, again, if you go and look at the official data for the surface of the moon, I wouldn't use Wikipedia, I avoided that source, but the actual surface temperature on the moon averages 107 degrees centigrade. So that's the average temperature on the surface of the moon.
So that's higher than boiling water.
Right, 107 degrees centigrade. That's the average, not the maximum, that's the average temperature. So that's 224 Fahrenheit to do the conversion. And somebody sent me a few years ago an interesting link. A chap in Germany actually sent me this link. Said, go and look at the Lunar Rover Vehicle Operations Manual. And this is a public document. It's on one of the NASA archives, and you can go and download this document yourself. And it actually gives the specification and the tolerances for parts of the lunar rover system, one of which is the battery. And if you look at this column of data, these columns of data on their own data, maximum operating temperature limit for the lunar rover battery is 125 Fahrenheit. 125 Fahrenheit.
Which is in centigrade?
It's going to be about sort of
times by 5, divide by 9, and add 32 or something like that.
Yeah, that's right. It's going to be about 80 or 90 80 centigrade, right, something like that.
Just to make a comment from an engineer, right? I worked for years and years with hardware engineers designing all kinds of different things that would work outside on motorway systems, things in power stations, on railway lines, and when you're designing something, especially if it's going to work outside, whoever's manufacturing the subcomponents, there will be a temperature range that it will operate in, and you would not select that component, and if its operating range was outside of where it's going to be used, and that would be the most standard engineering practice to do that. So, for me, that is another smoking gun, Andrew. That they would fit a component, especially at NASA, into a device that specification was way outside its operating range. It's just the most basic of engineering errors.
Right, absolutely. So we have, you can see that right there from their own information is the hardware would not have worked. So yeah, so if the rover could not have worked, then why are they putting out this story that they took up a rover, took the rover to the surface of the moon? And also other people have pointed out, I haven't put it in my presentation, but you can speed up the film of the rover by about a factor of 1.5 times or 2 times, and it just looks like a car driving on a set, with the dust flying up and so on.
And there's another, you mentioned earlier that there's no cooling system on those rovers, which would mean they would be ridiculously hot.
Right.
Okay.
The components would all get very, very hot, and the tyres would get very hot as well. Obviously, the rover can withstand heat and so on, but all kinds of problems like that.
And the same applies to the module that they used to get off the moon as well. That would have it was on the surface for hours.
Right. I mean, I think they were landed for 7-8 hours or something on the first mission. I don't think they were there very long. But I pointed out to people, I think in this presentation I also make a point of it. If you drive to the supermarket and you're on an asphalt surface, you go in and get some stuff and it's a hot sunny day in the middle of the summer and it's 25-30 degrees, you put the windows up so that nobody nicks anything from your car. You come back to your car after maybe half an hour, whatever, an hour, and you put your hands on the wheel and you're going to hurt your hands.
And if it was 107 degrees,
how did they maintain the internal temperature to something that the astronauts could stand? They claim that they had battery power for the air conditioning. That's the official claim, as I understand it, that the air conditioning within the module was battery powered. But you can compare it to a car because you've got 3 guys in there, so you're going to have a similar sort of volume of air within the module to a car. You don't have any convection on the moon because there's no atmosphere. So a car can be cooled by convection. In other words, when you start driving the car, the air coming past the car will cool it down. You can't do that on the moon because there's no gas to give that sort of cooling. So you can only cool it by radiation. So how did they do it? How did they keep the lunar module cool? I mean, to me, when I thought about it, I never thought about this years ago. When I believed the Apollo story. How did they keep it cool?
Now, also related to temperature on the surface of the moon, one of the astronauts on the later missions actually placed an object on the moon is for sort of sentimental reasons. Just tell us about that. And you've done a little experiment to try and replicate this.
That's right. Charlie Duke, and what he decided to do is because of Mama's apple pie and those sorts of American, cultural ideals. Looking at the Charlie Duke photograph, Charlie Duke was one of the astronauts on Apollo 17, I think, or Apollo 16. And he took this photograph of his family with him and he put it in a clear plastic bag and he put it on the surface of the moon. And we have a NASA image of that family photograph, in other words, a photograph of a photograph allegedly on the surface of the moon. And I saw this web page 2, 3, 4 years ago, and it said, well, this is impossible because the average temperature of the moon, the average temperature is over 100 degrees, 107 Fahrenheit. And if you have...
Centigrade.
centigrade, correct, 225 Fahrenheit, just above the boiling point of water. And if you have a photograph, now remember, photographic paper is made of a number of layers. It's got a layer that actually takes the image and makes the image with whatever chemicals they put on there, that have like a card layer behind it to give it some rigidity. And those layers, when heated up, expand at different rates, just like a bimetallic strip in a thermostat would. So this photograph will curl up, and you can show this. All you need to do is get a photograph, put it into an oven, and it will curl up.
And you did that, so let's just take a look at it.
So here we have a family photograph, and over here we have an oven, and this oven is set to 100 degrees centigrade, and I'm now going to put this photograph in the oven. She's cooking some of my dinner, and then I'm going to watch it through the glass. And that you can see that in very short order trying to get better light, but you'll see it when I open it. This is curling up within seconds. So I think that's a pretty convincing demonstration. And here it is. You can see it there, curled up, and that's only at 100 degrees centigrade.
Would it behave the same with air around it, do you think, Andrew? Do you think that
right,
makes
well, I mean,
a
that's the question. I haven't done this in a vacuum, so it's not a 100% accurate simulation, but I don't know of any reason why having air around it would
stop it from
curling. Yeah, right. Yeah. I mean, obviously in this example the air is transferring the heat to the photograph, but in the example of the surface of the moon, the bag was in contact with the surface of the moon, yet it didn't. There appears to be no significant effects on the heat. So that right there, to me, proves that photograph cannot be taken on the surface of the moon.
Right. And you showed an image of a footprint, which is a very famous image,
right,
from an astronaut's boot, which shows very clear, very well-defined lines of the sole of this boot, and you would contend that that looks like it's got moisture in it.
Well, this is, again, if you look at that image, it's the iconic image of the first footprint on the moon. I made a couple of observations about this photograph. Remember, these were cameras are mounted on the chests of the astronaut, so he's going to have to bend right over to take a good, clear picture of this. They had no viewfinders, but the shot is well framed. So that's one comment about that particular photograph. But the other comment, as you said, is about the impression. If you look at the way that those grooves of the boot are pressed into the surface of the moon, to me, maybe some expert in materials who can correct me on this if I'm wrong, because I wouldn't say I'm an expert on this, but to me, to get that sort of impression, you need moisture to bind those particles of together.
So if you were on just a sandy beach with no moisture, it wouldn't leave a print like that.
No. If you've got Wellington boots on and you're on the top part of a beach away from the sea, where the sand is all dried out completely and it's just grains, you don't get footprints like that.
You would nearer the sea where it's still damp.
Correct. And that looks like that footprint has been made in some type of sand with moisture in it.
Right. All right.
So
and the surface of the moon won't have moisture in it?
Apparently not, because again it's 100 degrees centigrade, so any moisture would have boiled off.
Today we have with us a group of students, among America's best. To you we say, we have only completed a beginning. We leave you much that is undone. There are great ideas undiscovered, breakthroughs available to those who can remove one of truth's protective layers. There are places to go beyond belief. Those challenges are yours. In many fields, not the least of which is space, because there lies human destiny.
remove one of truth's protective layers. He's not talking about scientific discovery with that statement, is he?
I was surprised by that speech, because if he was talking about discoveries, he would say, you know, we've had recent advances in computer technology, we're now getting the internet developing. You know, he would have known about the early development of the internet, I'm sure, in the early 1990s, when the internet started to get going, and, you know, the World Wide Web was started and so on. You would have thought he would have spoken more in that sort of language, rather than truth's protective layers. I mean, protecting what exactly?
And let's just play the clip of the astronauts at the Apollo 11 press conference, where it clearly looks like they're uncomfortable with what they're being asked to do at the conference. They just returned from the moon a few weeks earlier, and it's their first sort of public airing. Just watch the body language in this clip.
It was our pleasure to have participated in one great adventure. It's an adventure that took place not just in the month of July, but rather one that took place in the last decade. We all here and the people listening in today had the opportunity to share that adventure over its developing and unfolding in the past months and years. It's our privilege today to share with you some of the details of that final month of July that was certainly the highlight for the three of us of that decade. We're going to divert a little bit from the format of past press conferences and talk about the things that interested us most, in particular the things that occurred on and about the moon. We will use a number of films and slides which most of you have already seen, and with the intent of pointing out some of the things that we observed on the spot, which may not be obvious to those of you who are looking at them here from the surface of Earth. Our memory of that actually differs little from the reports that you have all heard from those previous Saturn V flights. And
when you first stepped on the moon, did it strike you as you were stepping on a piece of the Earth, or sort of what your inner feelings were, whether you felt you were standing in a desert, or this was really another world, or how you felt at that point?
Well, there was no question in our minds where we were. We've been orbiting around the moon for quite a while. At the same time, we have experience.
What do you consider the most important piece of advice and recommendation that you will give the Apollo 12 crew before the takeoff for the moon in November, gentlemen?
I didn't hear the first part. The recommendations for 12 on which phase?
Will be the most important piece of advice or recommendation for the Apollo 12 crew.
I think we can say that overall we wouldn't change the plan that we used or the plan that they intended.
Will you recommend any changes in procedures for the moonwalking and exploration procedure? And did you find that your suits were mobile enough in view of the changes, or would you recommend further mobility features for them for operation on the moon?
Well, one gets used to the tight mobility that your suit affords you.
Secondly, when you looked up at the sky, could you actually see the stars and the solar corona in spite of the glare?
Many of us and many other people in many places have speculated on the meaning of this first landing on another body in space. Would each of you give us your estimate of what is the meaning of this to all of us?
You want to try that?
Check from you.
And of course, Andrew, these three guys all resigned shortly after they came back, which Neil Armstrong, I think, was going to be set up as NASA's spokesperson, this kind of thing, but quite a religious man, or very religious man, and the sort of man who I think Armstrong has strong principles. I think he's a highly reliable person, and I just think that he left because he was being asked to tell lies, possibly. What are your views on that?
Well, I mean, we could, again, we're speculating with the reason. We don't really know why he resigned. One could, one of the arguments that's just come into my mind, for example, is that they knew he was going to need to go on to do lots of interviews and lots of public appearances, which actually he didn't do that many of, but nevertheless you could argue that that was going to take up so much of his life that he wouldn't be able to continue with the astronaut program because he was so famous. You could make that argument, but actually he didn't give that many interviews in proportion to the sort of figure he was. He gave relatively few, and that's one of the things that people have pointed out. And why? But why would Aldrin resign? Why would Collins resign? Why didn't they become trainees for the next group of astronauts or something?
Right.
That would seem more logical, wouldn't it? But focusing on Collins, what he said at the press conference, which he'd shown the clip from, there's one thing we can highlight, and he said that in the press conference he distinctly says, because Armstrong is asked by Patrick Moore about seeing stars, in the solar corona, I think is what Patrick Moore's interested in. Could you see the corona around the sun? And Michael Collins says, I don't remember seeing any stars.
We were never able to see stars from the lunar surface or on the daylight side of the moon by eye without looking through the optics. I don't recall during the period of time that we were photographing the solar corona what stars we could see.
I don't remember seeing any.
So he's in the command module, we do not remember seeing any stars. Yet he writes in his book Carrying the Fire, on page 221 from 1974, this book, that he was on a Gemini 10 spacewalk. My God, the stars are everywhere, above me on all sides, even below me somewhat, down there next to that obscure horizon. The stars are bright and they are steady. Of course, I know that a star's twinkle is created by the atmosphere, and I have seen twinkleless stars before in a planetarium, but this is different. This is no simulation. This is the best view of the universe that a human ever had. So why...
That's Michael Collins.
That's Michael Collins speaking about his Gemini 10 trip, but according to the press conference with the Apollo mission, he says he didn't remember seeing any stars.
Okay.
I mean, this is one of the stories which does not add up.
Right.